So welcome everybody to today's Aerospace UP meeting. It's part of our Aerospace UP Week. I'm Andrew Mair and I'm the Chief Executive of the Midlands Aerospace Alliance, and working with me on this is Pamela FRAeS, one of our technology managers, who's our producer today. So you'll hear from Pamela a fair amount too as we move through the meeting. Next slide. We've got a number of activities coming up to remind you. This is part of our Aerospace UP Week where we're looking at the supply chain. But next week we go back to our schedule of additive hours on Tuesday and Aerospace UP hours on Thursday. And if you're not sure quite what we do on these, have a look at our past events on our website and you'll see some of the things we've covered. In Drama Additive Hour for the next 3 weeks, we're going to be looking at non-aerospace companies, how additive is progressing outside the aerospace industry, and that'll provide some very good context for us. And then on Thursday next week, I'm sure we'll be catching up with some of the facts that are going on out there in the supply chain and some of the experiences of our member companies and sharing those with everybody. Next. So today's agenda is focusing on the resilience in the aerospace supply chain. We've got 4 special guests today that you already know about because you've seen them in the joining instructions or in the agenda for today. And this is how we're going to run that agenda. I'm going to talk about the MAA survey. We're going to talk about resilience, then the support available from I should say we're going to talk about resilience in individual organisations. Then we're going to talk about support from the Aerospace UP programme, and then have a discussion about the ecosystem as a whole and how companies manage their resilience within that overall ecosystem and some of the broader questions that are raised. Next. Over to you then, Pamela.
Yeah, so this is my bit. So lovely to see you, so many of you here. If those of you who are not going to be presenting or part of our panels, if you could switch your cameras off now. I'm going to hit the mute all button, and then the presenters will need to unmute themselves when they start talking. If you could display the chat box whilst we're having the meeting, hopefully most of you can find that now. I'm always tempted to say, if you can't find the chat box, send us a message in the chat box, and then realise the nonsense of that. We use the chat box both if you could put in now your full name and your company affiliation, so we know who's on the line, and then we'll use. You're welcome to highlight some topics you'd like to ask questions about to our special guests. But also, if there's comments that aren't really questions and just topics for discussion, you're also welcome to put those in there. We get a bit of discussion going sometimes. If you have a question, we'll bring you in at an appropriate point to ask it verbally to the presenters. And yes, we are recording this meeting. We've discovered that they do make quite good watching. We're going to edit it slightly to mainly to get rid of my gaffes, I think, is the usual practice, where the slides all go wrong. We'll maybe issue a blooper reel sometime in a few weeks. But be assured that the text chat doesn't appear in that recording, so that won't be made public. Want to say anything else about the recording aspect, Andrew?
No, that's absolutely fine, Pamela. So we haven't done this before, but just to let you know that we plan to do that and use it for trailers for future events as well. And hopefully people will find the discussion today useful and be able to point their colleagues towards it. So if you could go on to my slides, Pamela, I'd be grateful. The first items in our discussion. We can think about resilience, I was thinking, in lots of different ways, and we're going to treat it in whichever ways come to mind with our experts today, because there are various aspects of resilience and we won't be able to cover everything. For some people, it's about surviving now and getting through these few weeks. and for other sectors, I'm sure that that's the case. Then people are talking about surviving stronger, that actually they are the companies which survive any downturn and are resilient in the sense that they win out in the competition. So our French friends, for example, are trying to make sure their aerospace supply chain is resilient in the sense that when work picks back up, it all flows to France. A reasonable approach from them, which causes us some issues, of course. And then there's resilience in terms of being better prepared for next time this happens, whether it's a pandemic or elsewhere. Do we want to have been dependent on a particular supplier that might be located in Italy, and we're sole sourcing and there are issues that arise, and actually shut down production lines before the virus really hit the UK? And then we need to recognise that we can approach this from the viewpoint of individual companies or from the ecosystem as a whole, which is one of the approaches we're going to adopt today. So any perspective that we want to adopt for this, we're going to look at this morning, and our expert guests will guide us through their thoughts on the matter. But before we do that, just some thoughts on the overall context that we're all facing at the moment. Next. We looked at some of these matters, not exactly these slides, but with Robert Thompson from Roland Berger yesterday. This is a Richard Abulafia slide. Many of you know Richard at the Teal Group, who's a fantastic consultant for these purposes. So if you have an opportunity to join him on a webinar, you must do it. This is Richard's view earlier in the year of single aisle and twin aisle aircraft. So the red blip there in about 2019 is the problems of the 737. And this is in value terms, by the way. And you can already see the twin aisle fall off after the little bubble of orders in the early 2010s petered out. And then Richard has shown us with the next slide, Pamela, the impact of the coronavirus crisis as he foresaw it. And there's a dramatic change, not only for the twin aisle, but for the single aisle as well, before a recovery. And we can see the longer recovery of the twin aisle, according to Richard and many of the consultants, and Robert shared this yesterday, as those aircraft either come back into service later with companies that have got slots at airports using smaller aircraft, perhaps to begin with on those routes, but also because people are going to be perhaps more worried about flying longer distances in the current regime before we get a vaccine and we all feel safer. Next. If we just translate that into Rolls-Royce's own forecasts that have come out in their projections for their suppliers, and that we depend a lot on Rolls-Royce in our region, of course. The 3-year rolling average is the history of large engine deliveries from the Rolls-Royce annual accounts. The plan was to make more engines in 2020, and then for there to be a decline in 2021, largely related to the fewer of the twin aisle aircraft required as than expected, and Rolls-Royce having a strong position on those aircraft like the A330. But the forecast that Rolls put out to the supply chain a few weeks ago is the red bar, and you can see how dramatic the fall off there. And that is what, of course, is the background that's creating these issues of resilience and questions over that for us. Next. We translated that, and you can get this on our website. I did this in April. We translated that into an effect on the Midlands. The gold line was our benchmark of volumes of Airbus and Boeing aircraft being produced. So that's just a number, not a value. And the forecast was for that to recover in the dashed line after the problems of the 737. And our employment line we could see in the Midlands is the green, and our turnover line was the blue from our MAA annual survey and from checking that with numbers from Rolls and from one of our other tier ones in the Midlands. Then our forecast for the difficulties due to the coronavirus is the dashed blue line, and the gap in revenue is the red. So we can see the dramatic effect of the loss of revenue for an extended period, creating a particular crisis for our industry, and our cluster being worse affected than other regions because we are less diversified as a region, with 80% civil, 20% defence, whereas the UK as a whole is about 50-50, and there's a big Rolls-Royce impact on our region as well. So the employment reduction that we're already seeing coming through in terms of redundancies is likely to take that green line down below 100, and so all the employment growth that came within the last few years we're likely to lose in the next couple of years before hopefully we get a recovery again. So this is the context. Next. So let's look at what our survey showed us, and the survey closed 3 weeks ago, but it gives us some useful ideas as to what our companies are thinking. Next. This was the respondents for the survey in terms of their company type, so a broad range of companies, and fits nicely with what we know about the MAA membership and supply chain. Quite a lot of service sector companies, which are an important part of our membership. Next. Revenue decline, people expect that to be quite severe during the current year compared to what their projections were. Next. If we translate what a 40% revenue decline might look like for the year, it's quite severe, the impact in the second half of the year, which is what many of our suppliers are telling us, that they are really reducing their requirements for production output deliveries quite seriously for the second half of the year, and that's what leads to that average 61%. And it's the changes in the order books from the big companies in the last month or so that create that dramatic fall. And we'll come back to that question in a minute, because part of the issue of resilience is the way the whole supply chain performs, including therefore how the customers communicate with suppliers. Next. Next year, people expect a slight improvement, but our suspicion, having discussed this slide a few times, is that there's a fair amount of guesswork in this. Next. Resilient supply chain was number 4 of our priorities. We've talked about people and finance in the last 2 days. We'll be talking about new business and innovation in the next 2 days. And of course, we have to interpret what our members think when they are talking about resilient supply chains. 2021 next, please, Pamela. 2021 shows, relatively speaking, the supply chain resilience becoming slightly more important in people's thinking, whether that's their long-term strategy or they're thinking about coping better with the current situation. We're not quite sure. Next. The answers across our different types of companies are pretty similar, particularly when it comes to supply chain resilience. There isn't a dramatic change from one type of company to the next in terms of their prioritization here. Next. If we look at the detail of what companies are reporting, and in this slide we gave people 3 choices. We then have an others box that I'll come to in a second. We gave them these 3 choices, and visibility became a critical element for many of our suppliers around this period, partly because those changing order books were just coming through, and it's very difficult to plan. And the second option there is all about resilience in the sense of scaling back in order to ramp up, and the issues that we see caused with the whiplash effect in the supply chain, something that Bart MacCarthy is going to talk about a little later on, I think, in terms of how we plan these changes. So these are big issues for our suppliers, and they came out in the survey. Next. Next. So details, when we ask people for other, all about long-term perspectives, all about working together as a cluster, all about sharing information. And next one. And for our service providers, our specialists in service provision, a lot more detail, which is very interesting. First bullet showing that companies would be more resilient if their customers gave them better information about contracting with them. But as we know, many of the large customers simply cut off their activity at a certain period and don't communicate very much. And that has created short-term impacts again. So next slide. So just a bit of feedback from me then on the supply chain survey. As a bit of background, we clearly didn't cover all aspects of resilience, but it gives us a bit of a sense of what our companies are thinking, and information becomes critical for them, and behaviours of customers and suppliers become critical as well for the resilience of individual companies in the supply chain as a whole. So what I want to do now, Pamela, unless you suggest otherwise, is to move into our first discussion. And what we're going to do here is to invite David and Clive to present some of their ideas to us, starting with Clive. I think that's what we agreed, Clive. And David has a slide that we'll show later on. And I've asked Clive and David to talk a little bit about how they see resilience, choosing an aspect of it to talk about that. And then we're going to ask Alan to talk a little bit in terms of some feedback, Alan, on what David and Clive has presented, because Alan is right there on the front line as the Aerospace Director for Thyssenkrupp and facing some of these issues and managing his company in this environment as we speak. So over to you, Clive.
Thank you, Andrew. Good morning, everybody. Scenario planning has always been important in business because we do always live with uncertainties potentially coming up ahead of us. Although COVID-19 was actually pretty predictable, very few of us had actually done the work to prepare for it. And with hindsight, scenario planning in advance looks like a really good idea. Now we're in the midst of COVID-19, we can see that scenario planning has its value for looking at what we do now, and amongst others, Achieving the Difference has put out its views on what's going to happen to aerospace and defence as a result of COVID-19. And of course, going forward, it shouldn't just be COVID-19 that gets put into scenarios, it should be other potential events as well. So it gets used in three common ways. Immediately, we've had what do we do now, the response to the pandemic. We've observed that those with digitized supply chains or greater operational performance have had that supply chain visibility that's allowed them to respond well. The next step in the next phase in activity is recovery. So referring back to those charts that Andrew showed us, as demand does start to increase again, then there can't be a huge amount of certainty about what those levels are going to be. So scenario planning is important there. And one of the expectations, and there's some evidence of that happening already, is that the higher tier organizations will be consolidating their supply base on those with the best operational performance. So that means in the next phase, which we may call resurgence or growth, there's a bit of a choice. So companies with not the highest operational performance could be expected to atrophy as demand is lower than it was prior to the pandemic. There's the choice of improving operational performance to actually gain a greater share of the smaller pie as we come out of COVID-19. But of course, that's going to take some cash to actually make any investment in operational improvement. And maybe you're not content with just taking a slightly bigger share of a smaller pie. Well, there are other pies to look at. You know, there are sectors and niches that do offer some opportunity to at least maintain one size, and those are defence, which has been more resilient to COVID-19 as spending has continued, security, which is actually experiencing some growth, and there are areas of new technology where spending is actually generally continuing in alternative propulsion, particularly government spending there, and alternative kinds of air vehicles like urban air mobility, sub-regional aircraft with alternative propulsion, and particular technology where autonomy and in unmanned aircraft. And that's me.
Okay, just for the benefit of Midlands Aerospace Alliance members, my name is David Bailey. I'm now the Director of Aerospace Consulting, my own business. I used to be the Chief Executive of the North West Aerospace Alliance up until the end of January this year. I'm also the Chief Executive for Composites UK, the National Trade Association for the composites sector. At the moment, I still represent all of the regional aerospace alliances on the board of the Aerospace Growth Partnership. I sit on the board of the SC21 Supply Chains in the 21st Century programme, and I'm also invited into the Heads of Procurement round table that's being run by Aerospace Growth Partnership. I'm also an accredited assessor on the NMCL and SC21 Competitiveness and Growth programme. So hopefully I know a little bit about supply chains, and I'll give you my view on what resilience means in companies. But first of all, I wanted to sort of start with this slide, which shows the view that I've been working on with the North West Aerospace Alliance and Composites UK in terms of trying to describe the phases of the COVID-19 crisis. And there are lots of different ways that these are being termed, but I think they all really mean the same sort of thing. So what you can see on this slide is that there's an initial response phase as we see the industry fall off a cliff edge as lockdown went into effect around the world. Then you can see some period of stabilisation. I think some people expected a V-shaped bounce back, but it certainly feels more U-shaped. We'll recover to something, and there's obviously lots of talk about that being 30 to 40% of where we've been previously, and then a long period of growth back to where we've been previously or something like it, and talk there of whether it's single aisle aircraft, that being a 5-year period, or wide body aircraft, that being a 7-year period. Now, what I've tried to show on this slide is how trade associations have been supporting industry sectors through those different phases. You know, at the start, trade associations have provided support in terms of the advice that government is providing and spreading that. There's been support in terms of finding specific capabilities in the PPE and ventilator areas. Trade associations have been communicating funding support and trade surveys. There's been a lot of work around helping companies get back to work safely, and of course we're informing industrial policy. Going forwards, I think there's going to be a lot of help and support required into companies around how they resize their businesses, how the supply chain is recapitalised, because we'll see lots of debt within the supply chain. I think competitiveness is going to be absolutely crucial going forwards, and Clive touched on that earlier. We're going to need to find new customers and new programs if we're going to grow market share. I think we're going to have to really think very hard and start planning now for how we're going to be able to bring back the skills and capabilities that we are going to lose during this stabilise and recovery phase. We're going to see lots and lots of job cuts. I don't think companies will be able to support or hang on to skills and capabilities throughout the period that Andrew showed in that graph. So we've got to work out how we bring back those skills and capabilities later, and then we've got to get ready for technology shifts. What I've been advising companies to do, and clearly there's been a lot of focus on getting back to work safely in the early phase, but senior leadership team really need to start thinking about strategy around their annual business plan and around their sales, inventory and operations planning processes. Strategy, I think organisations really have to go back to the assumptions that they originally made, start to consider what really can be firm, contracted, ordered, forecast what have you really got in there that's aspirational. Where are we going to find that new work that might replace the work that's reducing significantly from civil aerospace primes and tier ones? I think you've got to go back to the annual business plan, got to think about how do you underpin that with full financial analysis. And I would say that this is the time to invest in sales, inventory and operations planning process capability. If I'm honest, I've done lots and lots of assessments of aerospace companies. Not many have got good load and capacity capability. Very few have got that standard 4-week S&OP process in place. And I think that's going to be absolutely key to organisations to be able to flex their plans. We're going to see a lot of change in the supply chain over the next 6 months. We can see the bullwhip effect in supply chains in normal situations. It's going to be much more significant, I think, going forwards. Lots and lots of short-term demand for stuff. So the ability to be able to flex the plan, I think, is absolutely key. I've also talked to friends in the automotive sector about what they think companies should focus on, and along with strategy and S&OP processes, risk management comes out really important, and also a niche one, situational leadership. We're going to be dealing with lots and lots of people who are stressed, who've got mental health problems as a result of COVID-19. And if we've got senior leadership teams who understand that situational leadership capability, I think they will be best capable to cope with dealing with their people through this crisis. And then a final point for me is around, actually, at this time, lean tools and processes become even more important because they contribute both to minimizing costs and to safety. So the more that we can standardize, the more safe our factories can be. And I think when we look at some of the processes such as high junker, and we look at leveling by volume and type, that's going to be really important when we're dealing with lots and lots of unevenness in productivity and orders. So I think there's something in there that again, we've got to go back to from a lean perspective. I think that's about my 5 minutes.
Yeah, no, thanks very much. Andrew, have you found out how to unmute yourself on your new connection?
Yeah, no, thanks very much. I disappeared, everybody. I got cut off, but I'm back on via my phone now, so I missed a little bit of Clive. Alan, from your 50,000 feet view. Oh no, back to the ground again. Alan, tell us a little bit about how you see the resilience question from the viewpoint of somebody right there in the thick of it, and how you react to some of the ideas that Clive and David have put up.
Yeah, really interesting actually listening to Clive and David. I think first and foremost, what we have seen throughout the aerospace supply chain, certainly coming from the top, is an attitude of one for one and all for one, in as much that the behaviours that we see at the various tiers of supply chain have really compromised their ability to be able to navigate our way through this as a collective, and we have seen, regardless of directives from the likes of Airbus level, we have seen many of the tier ones simply shutting their doors and saying no thanks, we don't care. To your point, David, about contracts and looking at what's in firm demand and what's in flexible demand schedules and managing those, that's absolutely correct. However, when the customers are just on a blanket basis turning around and saying don't care what the contract says, we're not accepting anything, and shutting doors or closing down, then you have a real problem flowing through the supply chain. You mentioned scenario planning, Clive. Done very well back in the financial crisis by McKinsey. There's a great video online that talks about their approach to scenario planning and how that played out through 2008, and you're absolutely right. The COVID crisis, perhaps with SARS, there was a warning shot there that we failed to adhere to. I also agree with you that very few companies have actually engaged in scenario planning, and that's really borne out by the way that we're all reacting to this current situation. I was interested, and perhaps when I finish, you can qualify what you mean by high operational performance, because again, I've said this before, and I'll be open and blunt about it here. The aerospace supply chain is governed by a race to the bottom. We want 100% quality and on-time delivery as long as it's cheap. That's what it boils down to. Okay, and I come from a manufacturing and raw materials background, so I can say that categorically. I've lived it. I do live it on a daily basis. And that's borne out by a lot of the sourcing strategies that we do see from many of the OEMs at the minute. So when we talk about supply chain consolidation, we've got to be mindful that a lot of the supply chain consolidation that's going on at a high level in aerospace at the moment is not in the UK and it is not in Europe. It's very much towards Southeast Asia. So that presents a big challenge for us, and it also talks to the difficulty that businesses find in achieving that agility to pivot and to move into different market opportunities. But I guess the one thing that's hurt us most has been, to David, to your point about a good SIOP process. I completely agree with you. Something that we're trying to do it, and I've seen done very well at other businesses. But fundamental to the SIOP process is getting the flow of information, or the detail of the information absolutely correct. And as you'll be well aware, and we'll all have seen it, there's often a huge disconnect between the information that flows out from an MRP system and the information that flows out from an S&OP system. So we really need to sort of clean up data and be clear throughout up and down supply chain when we're communicating demand levels and forecast levels, that we have our MRP and our S&OP actually aligned so that we can see the reality of the situation. And finally, obviously, cash has been one of the key survival indicators of any of the companies that are managing their way through this. And a lot of companies, I personally don't think we've seen the worst of the damage to the supply chain just yet. I think we're going to see more redundancies. I think we're going to see more downsizing as we move past the furlough scheme. I think the furlough scheme is putting a bit of a band-aid across that, which it was intended to do, but it doesn't change the fact that overall demand is much lower. So companies will be obviously more focused on developing their cash flow or optimizing their cash flow, and also optimizing their inventory management. So in terms of opportunities, both of you mentioned digitization. Completely agree. Digitization underpinned by robust S&OP and MRP outturns is absolutely the way to go, to give us that clarity and visibility of demand, and perhaps allow us to relook at the amount of inventory that we currently hold. I know of a lot of organisations where they thought they were holding 3 to 6 months worth of inventory and buffer stocks for the customer, and actually now, lo and behold, holding the thick end of 2 years. So again, that has that effect down through the supply chain, which is going to have to be managed out. If I can possibly offer one glimmer of hope just before I finish, and that is that Airbus are now asking supply chains to protect rate 45 on narrow body from March 2021. So that takes them back up to almost 70% of pre-COVID production levels. So perhaps that gives you a statement of intent as to what Airbus view of the world is, certainly in narrow body anyway. Wide body is a different kettle of fish. So yeah, number of challenges there, but for me, from what you guys have said, digitized supply chain leading to greater operational efficiency and that clarity of data flowing through the S&OP and MRP systems through all tiers of supply chain have got to be the way ahead for us.
Great, thanks very much, Alan. We've got a couple of questions or points. Tom Craman's made a point that isn't about all of you having been in the Navy together at different times, which is the fantastic chat which is going on, people making connections and networking, which is absolutely brilliant. Tom, do you want to come in and make your point now?
Hey guys, can you hear me?
We can,
Yep.
Tom.
Okay, perfect. So several things. Alan, agree with the PSYOP. My only challenge there is we're still having the goalpost changed on a weekly, if not a daily basis from the tier ones, which means that to be able to run a PSYOP, you have to have credible data. And there's still not credible data coming from the tier ones, which is making it, as you're well aware, impossible. And that's not just on the forecast element or the flexible, this is still on the firm. And I'm seeing fixed zone violations occurring on a daily, weekly basis because they still don't have a grasp of what they want to do. So that's the first point. And the second point is regarding the system improvements, whether or not that's to lean or investing in better PSYOP systems. The issue that you've got is a large majority of staff are on furlough now, and that's because industry is trying to safeguard their revenue, trying to minimize the impact that we're seeing, and being able to implement those changes is challenging when you don't have A, the resource, or B, the turnover to be able to go through that process. And these are just some of the behaviors that I'm seeing, and no doubt you guys are seeing on a daily basis. So I agree with what you're saying in principle, but in practice, it's a very difficult challenge to put in play.
Let's take a point. Alan, let's just take Mark Wood's point as well, and then we'll ask each of you to comment on those as well. David, I saw you had your hand up earlier, so I did see that, and you'll have time to come in a minute. Mark, you've mentioned McKinsey, I think. Is that the point that you wanted to make to us?
Yeah, I think, morning everyone. I think a lot of this is about operational resilience as much as anything else, and as well as diversification. And as ever, all of these things are interlinked and don't work in their entire in their own silo, if you like. I put a link on there to our own website, which has got a link to a McKinsey article, and they talk about 5 pillars, really, which are building operational resilience, accelerating end-to-end digitisation, rapidly increasing capital and operational expense transparency, driving the future of work. So I think that's more about how we manage with people, and reimagining the sustainable operations for competitive advantage. And within that, there's sort of a lot of enablers that they're giving some insights into that enable those 5 key pillars. I really think it's worthwhile people having a look at. I think it's a great article in itself.
Okay, thanks very much, Mark. And you've put the link, I think, in the chat if people are interested in
I have,
that.
yeah.
Which is kind. Thanks very much. So let's just go round the group again. I'm going to start with you, Clive, and responding either to Tom's point, I think really about the theory of digital planning is good, but the data isn't necessarily there. And then Mark's point about the fact that there's good advice out there from some of the big consultants.
Yes, well, I think, and Alan also made the point that we're suggesting investment in operational performance is the right thing to do, but there's also a race to the bottom, and it is going to be a difficult circle the square. The fact is that the end customer of all of this, us, we're willing to pay very little for an airline ticket, and we behave like absolute market tarts in choosing our airline tickets. Airline profitability has been good in the last 10 years or so. That has pushed it into net positive profit over its whole life cycle, when it was actually negative over its whole life cycle going into that. And by the end of this downturn, airline net profit over its whole life cycle will be negative again. So, right at the top end of our supply chain in commercial aerospace, there are extreme cost pressures. So that does get passed down to the people who build the aircraft, and then onto those that supply the parts for them. So that is kind of an inevitability. And some of the material that Andrew shared with us in advance of this was showing the kinds of financial support mechanisms that aerospace companies were using. And one of the most popular support mechanisms was supply chain. And we debated whether that meant that the supply chain was helping the higher tiers to fund their inventory, or whether it was just being done to the low tiers by the top end. And I suspect it's more the latter. The best way to fund your inventory is to not pay for it. So we think there's a lot going on, and recognise that it is a challenging position. But in terms of reducing cost, then in the Western world, our greatest option is through more capital intensive, higher performance methods, because we do have high labour rates, and removing as much of labour rate from our operations as possible is can be challenging, but that choice is stark between taking the same share of a smaller market or a bigger share of a smaller market.
Over to you, David.
I think the comment that Alan made around digitisation is interesting. The companies that I've worked in, I've probably assessed 80 different aerospace companies, from BA Systems down to micro-sized businesses, and very, very rarely do I see an organisation that has a good use of its MRP or ERP systems. What I typically see is everybody knifing and forking Excel spreadsheets on a daily basis to plan production. That is going to be really, really tough across the next 12 months. And the organisations who have got a good grip of their S&OP process and their ERP and MRP systems will be in a better position. I was saying in 2019 that I reckoned that in UK manufacturing, we typically had OEE levels, overall equipment effectiveness, of less than 50%. And yet we were struggling for capacity whilst Airbus was trying to increase rates. The capacity was there, we just weren't using it properly. Those companies that can use it properly across the next 12 months will be better off.
Thanks, David. Alan, some closing comments from you?
Yeah, I agree with Tom. An S&OP process is only as good as the front end data that's coming in. It has to have a clean pass from our customers, and therein lies the problem, as Tom's just highlighted. And yeah, finally, I just think that there is a lot more downsizing to come. We've already seen significant announcements in downsizing from some of our own, members and companies within the Midlands area, myself included. But I'm absolutely certain that there is more to come, and that is going to present big challenges again in meeting the demand going forward, should there be some kind of U-shaped recovery. So it's it comes back to the point about clarity of information shared up and down the supply chain, and as Tom says, it's just not there. And finally, the one thing, we should all be acting with integrity with each other, and we're absolutely not. And I mean that as a blanket statement. We've got to act with integrity and work with each other.
Well, for a more efficient, better solution, if nothing else, Alan, that's clearly the case. So, and hence sharing information that we can do at least horizontally in the MAA, but we need to try to encourage the customers with the suppliers. One thing I think we are going to do, Alan, is that we've agreed with a large company in the Midlands to pool some of our experience and feed it back to them. Because it's not clear that the senior managers at that large company are aware of what's happening in procurement and what the potential impacts might be when they do want to change things up again. So we can do that. Whether they will be able to take on board these thoughts and these experiences remains to be seen, because they, like everybody else, are finding the current situation difficult to manage. So thanks very much to our panel for that very useful discussion. We'll see Clive and David back as part of our next discussion, and thanks very much to you, Alan, for your usual high level of support for us. That's much appreciated. So what we're going to do next is ask Christine and Dan from the university to talk a little bit about the support that the Aerospace UP programme can offer suppliers. And we found that if we look at the challenges that our supply chain faces, such as those that we've just been looking at now, we find that the Aerospace UP programme, an innovation programme, can actually be quite supportive across quite a wide variety of different requirements that companies have. So companies planning to innovate in terms of their planning systems in order to serve markets better could well be eligible for support, so don't neglect that. So over to you, Christine and Dan.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. Hello, everyone. My name is Christine, and thank you to the speakers and the insight you've given us on the current developments in the aerospace supply chain. Pamela, if I could ask you to bring up my slide on the project, please, with the different activities and the map that we have. So
apologies,
the aerospace
got the wrong way round.
Don't worry, I'll just start anyways. So the Aerospace Unlocking Potential Programme, or Aerospace UP as we try to call it short, is a 20 million programme. It's going to go for 3 years, and it aims to support the aerospace supply chain in the Midlands, as Andrew has said correctly. As you will see from the logos above me and on the slide that you'll have in front of you now, I hope. It's jointly being delivered by the University of Nottingham and the Midlands Aerospace Alliance. And it's also being supported through the European Regional Development Fund, which helps businesses to access funding and expertise to improve their performance through innovation in all aspects of their enterprise. And this funding is already secured, so these monies are in Britain and they're guaranteed by the government. And so whatever's going to happen around Brexit will not affect the programme. So we can participate. The programme is funded through 8 local enterprise partnerships. So it's the ones that you can see on the map there. So SMEs that are located in these lab areas can benefit, can become beneficiaries of Aerospace UP. And companies that are already in the aerospace supply chain, but also companies that would like to enter aerospace as a market, are welcome to do and to participate. And we're also looking at supporting not only the manufacturing companies in the supply chain, but all the service providers industry can participate as well. And we do think there's quite a scope for them as well to actually do innovation projects within their companies and their enterprises. So the activities that we offer through Aerospace UP are workshops and dissemination events. So the whole series of events we're having this week are organized through Aerospace UP. We've had the Aerospace UP Hour since the lockdown basically started, since the crisis started earlier this year, hosted through the MAA. And that has been a great place to just, keep in touch with each other, to have market updates and to see how companies are doing with the situation. And as a result of those hours, actually this whole week basically, was set up as well. The workshops that we will be doing are going to be on more technical topics, such as digital manufacturing, for example. And Clive was speaking of operational improvements earlier that are sort of required to deal with the situation we're in right now. And we're actually going to have a few workshops on that as well, preparing. And my colleague Dan is going to touch on those a bit later. Yeah, Aerospace UP offers you consultancy services. Our whole delivery team is here to help you to identify how we can best support you through the project. We've got quite a big toolbox within Aerospace UP, and there is no one-fit-all solution for all the companies out there. So we're here to help you with, for example, access to talent from the university through student placements, or to get you connected to academics that are doing research in areas that you might be interested in. We can help you to apply for other public funding that's out there. There's a lot of expertise at the IAT, at the Institute for Aerospace Technology, with regards to, ATI funds, for example. So we're pretty good at that. And the technology managers are here to come and visit your companies to see where you could improve productivity, to do technology road mapping with you. And they're also going to be here to support you with any ideas you have for R&D projects. And speaking of which, we have a pot of £5.4 million available, which we'll be giving out to companies to support them with innovation projects. And that's really innovation in all aspects of your company. So these grants can be spent on the development of any technology, process, or product that is new to your company. So if you're interested in these projects, I do encourage you to join us on Friday this week, where we'll have a whole session to show you many different examples of innovation projects that you can do, and to give you ideas on how to spend the grant money we've got available for you. And lastly, I think the last activity I didn't mention yet are technical support projects. These are being delivered through the university's Precision Manufacturing Centre. And I'll ask my colleague Daniel Symes now to give you more details on that, who works for the PMC at the uni. So if we could change slides, and Daniel, over to you.
Thanks, Christine. Morning, everyone. So as Christine said, I'm Dan Symes. I work at the Precision Manufacturing Centre at the University of Nottingham. I've been there probably for about just over 3 years now, working predominantly on ERDF projects, so similar sort of structure to this Aerospace Unlocking Potential project, but also on commercial projects as well. So the Precision Manufacturing Centre at University has probably been around since 2003, and it provides a range of world-class services to industry. So these services we typically provide a business range from the development of new product designs and manufacturing techniques to pilot production of low volume, high value products, as well as specialist sort of training as well. In January 2018, we moved to a new building, which you can see behind me as I'm presenting here today with an image of, based at Jubilee campus at the university. It's a £24 million advanced manufacturing building, which is where we now reside. As of yesterday, our technicians, our technical team was allowed back in the university, one of the first teams to be allowed back on site. So we are back up and running now. So we are able to take on new projects at this moment in time. We're an ISO 9001 certified centre. All of our technicians come from industry, so they're all used to working with clients and on industrial sort of calibre projects. Sometimes you have the misconception that we have students working on commercial projects for clients, but that's not the kind of way it works. We do have researchers coming in and being assisted by the technicians, but that's a side to what services we provide for business. So the centre itself is a combination of equipment which has been gathered by academics over the last 10-15 years, which is cutting edge research at the time and was fairly advanced equipment. Which is now being used for commercial services, really. With any project we do through the ERDF or commercial services, we typically get NDAs signed up front between the two businesses, just for peace of mind, and any IP that's developed through the ERDF project or commercial services is owned by the business. We're here at the end of the day to help businesses grow and innovate and be more productive. So it's not within our interest to hinder any IP. So everything we're trying to do is to help businesses within the Midlands with this project. Next slide, please, Pamela. So we've got two types of services we typically do. We have our non-technical and technical services. So whilst we've been shut down as a university since mid-March, we've been doing a lot. We've only been able to do our consultancy services. So this is just to give an example of what we typically do. It's usually mould tool design. So one of our technicians is used to be a mould tool designer in an industry. We do a lot of CNC programming, product design and design for manufacture. And we also do some innovative research around materials and actual manufacturing processes as well, which we can actually produce reports for as well. On to the next slide, please, Pamela. So in terms of our technical capabilities, which are now back online as of yesterday, we're able to do some ultra precision complex engineering. So we have machines that can do 3, 4, 5 axis milling, turning and EDM. We can typically work down to accuracy of plus or minus 0.5 microns. So we can work anywhere. It doesn't have to be that accurate. We can work in that range all the way up to that. We've got rapid prototypes. We've got a small 3D printer. We do some precision engineering, tool making, mold and press. We also, as part of being an ISO 9001 centre as well, everything that we manufacture in the actual centre does go through a verification process on one of our coordinate measurement machines in 99% of cases to ensure it is to the client's specifications, and that's then when the components get delivered with a report as well at the same time. But we'll also have capability to do visual analysis as well through microscopy. So we have an optical microscope as Zeiss, and we have a scanning electron microscope as well to look at more detail if we need to as well. So there's a whole range of equipment there which allows us to do most jobs which come into the centre and things, and all of our technicians are experienced and experts in using this equipment and giving suitable advice and consultancy to the businesses as well. Next slide, please. So a typical intervention of what we do through the ERDF programmes is, so a business who's eligible for the programme contacts us, the PMC, with a project or problem that they're having with a component which might need development. Typically before this, we'll get an NDA signed in place, put in place for peace of mind. That idea and concept is then communicated to our centre, where our technicians will have a look at the drawings and provide some guidance or consultancy or advice, depending on what they've seen. And then we will then look at, depending on the complexity of the actual component, look at manufacturing a jointly agreeable volume of them, usually prototyping 1 or 2 up to small batches, really, but it really depends on the complexity and time that it will take to it, because that's how the ERDF projects kind of work. It's kind of like a time limited based support through the PMC. And once we've obviously produced the actual small batches or prototypes, we then verify them and issue reports with them when we deliver the components as well. And hopefully, like you say, the idea with the PMC is by giving this sort of like free support, obviously, we're looking to produce sort of longer term collaborative projects with businesses further down the line, whether that be through future funding proposals or through commercial services as well. Next slide, please. So just a few case studies. I mean, one of the things that interests me a lot about this job and the things I enjoy the most is with these ERDF projects. This project, for example, is very aerospace orientated sector, relevant to that sector. We get all kinds of work in, because we have a number of these projects on the go, and the sectors we work with in the projects, we don't know what's coming in the doors from one day to the next. We do get the weird and wonderful projects through sometimes, but here's just a little example of some of the actual projects we've worked with before. So some of them are relative to actually for businesses that do operate in the aerospace sector, and we're looking to explore new markets as well at the same time. So that's just a quick overview there of some components. And there's more case studies on our website as well, which you can see in the top right-hand corner. Next slide, please. So that's kind of it from a technical sort of PMC point of view, what sort of technical support's available for the project. Christine briefly mentioned earlier about some webinars and workshops we'll be doing also as part of the project. As we've been running these aerospace up hours every Thursday for over at least a month now, it's quite interesting to hear what problems businesses are having, and we're trying to tailor our support to make it most suitable and of most value to the businesses who actually want to enrol and get involved in the project. So we keep hearing a lot about productivity and streamlining and leaner workforces. So what we're currently in the process of doing, and this will be finalised in the next couple of weeks, is we're going to be running a programme of 8 sets and 8 2-hour webinars on some Lean Six Sigma principles, which can be run right now within businesses to improve these processes. So the actual webinars will be run by a Master Black Belt, Lean Six Sigma trainer. I've probably known this guy for 2-3 years. I've done his workshops before, and they are fantastic. They're really good. Some of the feedback we've had on previous slightly different iterations of this, usually been done actually in person, have gone down really well with businesses mainly based in Derbyshire and Nottinghamshire. But with this project, we're looking to expand that over the whole of the Midlands. So with it being a webinar, there's a few logistical differences we'll have to do compared to other runnings of this actual session. So that in the first cohort, we're going to have to limit it to 20 attendees. But we're looking to maybe expand, if this is a successful trial almost, we'll expand that to 50 personnel in the next one. So for the first run, we're going to limit it to one place per business. And then obviously expand it to make it, if we rerun it, if it's really popular, we'll expand that and make it a lot more flexible from that point of view. So just to give it a sample of some of the proposed subjects as well, you can see on the right there, that's just some of the ones we're talking about at the moment. But what I would ask anybody who's interested in this or has any ideas, if there's anything in this field that you think would be of interest or value to your businesses, please feel free to get in contact so we can tailor these workshops accordingly to what you think would add value right now to your businesses. So like I say, feel free to contact myself. That email address at the top there is where I can be contacted through, or even drop it into Andrew and Pamela at the MAA or Christine as well at the University of Nottingham. And we'll take that feedback to tailor this course so it's of maximum value to the businesses who are attending. Great, I think that's it for me. So thank you for that. Thank you. I'll pass back to Andrew.
Great, thanks very much, Dan. That's really interesting. I'm going to ask Pamela to put up Professor Bart MacCarthy's slide, which will help us introduce the next session while we're just making that transition. Coming through, and they've only got 70% of their workforce. So I'm sure there's a lot of work in operations planning that can be done to cope with and manage the situations that companies find themselves in, and that agenda of trying to keep costs under control when your customers are only giving you much smaller amounts of work than you'd expected. So, and just to let you know, as well as that support from the Aerospace UP programme, both Clive and David run consultancy companies, and if you're interested in getting some support from them, I'm sure they'd be very happy to talk to you from a strategic viewpoint. And we also had our member company, Grant Thornton, with an offer to talk to them about getting a strategic advice, not just financial. They offered that to us 10 days or so ago. And if you've been on these sessions, you know that we've repeated that offer as well. So Pamela, how are we doing with getting Bart's slide up? Fantastic. So just let Tony in here. And Bart, thank you very much for joining us today, and I'm glad you could be here for the earlier session as well, and you'll be able to make some links there. So over to you, Bart, for some of your ideas about resilience in the current downturn.
Andrew, how long have I got? 5
minutes or so still.
Okay, let me be quick then. I'll try and contextualize what I say in the light of what Clive, David and Alan were saying earlier. If you could move on, please, Pam. So I'm Bart MacCarthy. I've done a lot of work in aerospace and automotive, particularly around planning and designing planning systems and IT to support planning systems. This slide was obviously designed for a different audience because it's showing you where Nottingham is, but I'm sure all of you know. Okay, if you can move on. Sales and operations planning was mentioned frequently in the earlier discussions. When we teach sales and operations planning, this is often a kickoff slide we show. And we say that in order to inform sales and operations planning, you need to be aware of the external environment and you need to be aware of your internal capabilities to develop realistic, usable and flexible plans, and that's under normal conditions. However, we're not in normal conditions. We've moved on from normal conditions to some of the most unprecedented conditions anybody can remember. If you could move on. Pam, please. Resilience in aerospace was one topic I was asked to comment on. I said here, aero is different. Aero and defence. Different to what, you might ask? Well, different to automotive. If you look at volumes, if you look at lead times, if you look at the opportunities to substitute, if you look at the requirements for accreditation and certification, what all this means is there are very high barriers to entry. It also means that your tier ones, I know many of you are SMEs, but your tier ones can't switch very quickly. The usual measures for resilience that we talk about in supply networks, redundancy and capacity cushions, multi-sourcing, these are really problematic in aerospace because of all these issues around certification, around lead time. One thing that I've noticed in my work in the sector has been that these long lead times and issues around certification often mean that we have quality problems that persist, that wouldn't typically persist in other sectors. We have workarounds, we have concession systems. And one of the messages I would say is now is possibly the time to really have a look to see whether you could fundamentally root cause and address these quality issues. Next slide, please. So what to do? Well, I'm saying here, knowledge is power. It's absolutely crucial to know your network or networks. It's amazing how little information some companies have on their upstream beyond one tier, and indeed often they're downstream. So auditing your networks, understanding, being aware, addressing persistent quality problems, I've already mentioned that. Being alert. We've heard about some of the issues about the primes, but being fully alert, awareness from the primes, from government, industry associations, like the Midlands Aerospace Alliance, and of course your supply chain contacts. Also, I think this is the time to really think about your core capabilities, honing them, doing a capabilities audit, skills inventory. What are your really core technical and managerial capabilities that you want to protect? Next slide, please. The other issue I was asked to talk about was capacity. And capacity is fundamental. Understanding capacity, defining it, measuring it, planning for it, having it available ahead of need, utilizing it. It's easy for fixed static systems. For our complex aerospace manufacturing systems, capacity is a real challenge. How do we measure? How do we assess? How do we utilize effectively? Next slide, please. I'd still kind of underscore some of the key messages we put forward in planning, and that's to do it at multiple levels over multiple time horizons. The higher levels, the longer term, you've really got to be thinking about aggregate, whether that's at the business unit, factory, product level. But you've also got to be thinking about it the next level down, particularly in the current climate, understanding capacity on key bottleneck resources. In the earlier discussion, quite a lot was said or mentioned about scenario planning. This is an area I've done quite a lot of work in. What are the key issues in scenario planning? Well, thinking about feasible, likely future scenarios, thinking about how your organization will react, thinking about how your competitors will react, thinking about how your supply chain will react, understanding perhaps three, high, medium, low. Nothing's going to return to normal quickly, but things will return to a new normal. What kind of time periods are we thinking about? And this should feed into your medium-term sales and operations planning process. Developing a capacity plan for each. and understanding what are the vital capacities that you want to protect. That's all I was going to say on these topics. Let me very briefly mention one other. If we could have the next slide, please. One of the areas we're doing research on is blockchain in the supply chain. Blockchain has, many of you will know from Bitcoin, the kinds of blockchains we're thinking about in supply chain contexts are different. They are private, closed blockchains. And there's a lot of interest in the technology at the moment, particularly in certified sectors like aerospace. We're working with Jaguar Land Rover at the moment, looking at the battery supply chain, looking at the leather supply chain, and we are seeking more partners to help us with this work. The US's Aerospace Industry Alliance has got a good report I could send you details on a lot of the pilot ecosystem blockchain technologies that are coming on stream, and all the major players have got blockchain initiatives currently. What I would say is you don't have to understand anything about blockchain to participate in our work. We can explain it to you. What do you get from a participation? Well, actually, we promise you a map of your supply network. So if you're interested, we can certainly have a discussion. We're interested in SMEs, we're interested in larger first-tier suppliers, and indeed in primes. Okay, Andrew, I think that's just about 5 minutes.
That's absolutely brilliant, Bart. Thank you very much. I'm sorry to stress you with a lot of valid and valuable information that has to be compacted into a small time. We'll talk to you afterwards if we might invite you back, because I think to go through some of these issues in more depth with companies, and particularly this point about using the downturn as an opportunity to restructure and not simply shrink, and the questions over productivity that we mentioned, an interesting outcome from this meeting for me. So thanks very much. So what I want to do now is,
if I could just add, Andrew,
please,
I was very interested in what David was saying about sales and operations planning, and what he's seeing is what I've seen often. It's good in the primes from their perspective. Deeper in the supply chain, sales and operations planning processes are still relatively primitive in many organizations, and we need to see more rigorous critical in sales and operations planning, and it's probably more critical now than ever. So I'd underscore all of those points.
So thanks very much, Bart. Pamela, do you want to pin me to these pictures? You can probably see me because I was speaking, but we know that for recording it's probably better if you pin me. So while Pamela's doing that, David, I think you have been given a good entree there.
Thank you, Andrew. In the first session, we talked about resilience really at the company level. We talked about scenario planning, we talked about strategy, we talked about S&OP type processes. In this second session, I really wanted to talk about resilience at the supply chain level, and currently what's going on to try to affect that. If we look at supply chains in the UK, I think sort of prior to the COVID-19 crisis, we were actually seeing more and more consolidation of work into the primes, into the OEMs, as they realised that there was significant IPR and revenue streams associated with the aftermarket. So there's one view that could continue further, and we would go back more towards an industry that probably looked like what we could see in the 1990s. There is a second view that consolidation within the industry will take place within Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3 of the supply chain, and we will see stronger, more diversified and vertically integrated Tier 1 suppliers. Now, what I would say is that I think rationalisation and consolidation of the supply chain is going to happen. It's not the case that necessarily everybody will shrink in size by 30 to 40%. I think that this crisis is giving customers the opportunity to choose what supply chains they might wish for going forwards. And to that effect, there is some stuff going on in the UK. So some of you will have heard about the ADS Airbus Supply Chain Task Force, which is being led by Tom Williams, the ex-Airbus UK Chief Operating Officer. That has partners with the likes of Rolls-Royce, Safran, Bombardier, GKN, Spirit and Collins. That is looking at who's currently strong within the UK supply chain, who's performing, who's weak within that supply chain. They're looking at what's the opportunities in terms of influencing that rationalisation and consolidation of the supply chain, and also looking when will demand normalise, but also are there opportunities from them working together in order to try and smooth demand. Now, in addition to that, I've been involved in the Aerospace Growth Partnership Heads of Procurement roundtable that took place last month. That included primes and tier ones such as Airbus, Safran, GE, Leonardo, Thales, Meggitt, Boeing, along with Rolls-Royce, GKN, Spirit. So that looked at who were their top 20 suppliers in the UK and which were the companies that appeared in a number of different supply chains. They looked at the issues around civil and defence revenue split to see whether those companies that had got more defence work, whether they were more resilient. We looked at who were the critical suppliers in the supply chain, and that's not necessarily those in a bright, shiny new facility. That can be the ones that have got a 50-year-old 80-ton press that nobody else in the world has got. We looked at what the supply chain issues were likely to be in the short term. We looked at how those organisations were supporting suppliers, and also how suppliers were accessing government support. So from a structural perspective, there is work going on to try to understand what supply chains might look like in the new normal. And I think that's about my 5 minutes.
Thanks, David. I think we're developing agendas for future meetings as we speak here, which is absolutely brilliant. We had the earlier points about whether the planning systems on the one hand are superior, but the data is not so superior. But also your point there about, we were talking about restructuring as opposed to just shrinking within companies, that taking place at the level of the supply chain as a whole, potentially. And that we need to think about where companies position themselves there. So no, thanks very much. Clive, over to you, and to see what thoughts you might have on what Bart said and what David has said, and see how we sort of finish off our conversation here. Clive.
Sure. Yeah, I was interested in particularly a couple of David's points there. Mentioned MRO. Commercial MRO is severely down because we're flying less, but there are specific niche activities. You still run a plane, does come with some cost. You can't just park it and leave it. There are things that have got to be done, and there will be things to get things back in service. So we can expect a wave of activity to get aircraft back into service. On one side of the reduced fleet we're likely to see coming out of this is there will be a larger number of aircraft getting retired and parted out, so there's going to be quite a wash of spares with some life left in them on the aftermarket. And on the consolidation front, we have anecdotal stories from some of our contacts that they're very acquisitive at the moment, despite a downturn. One in particular that's the smaller end of PLCs. I'd call them a very sort of large medium company, and they're particularly interested in power electronics, and they're continuing with a pretty aggressive acquisition plan despite what's been happening. But they went into this with a very good cash position. So yes, I think those organisations, again reflecting on operational performance. So those that are good may also be on that acquisition path to take on bits of the market that they've always been interested in and want to take on someone and improve their performance. And we've seen it down at our end as well. Two companies in Bristol, AVPE and Reckitt, have just merged. It's interesting it's happened down at that level as well. At the top, very difficult to see what might come out of that in consolidation. They play their cards very close to their chest, so we might expect to see some. And Bart's material, very interesting. A lot of pointers there on that. David and myself were earlier saying operational performance is very important. And these are a lot of the ways to get there. Perhaps I know David, you've had some thoughts on sources of funding for that kind of improvement. And earlier on we had the comment that we'd like to improve, but we can't afford it.
So listen, Clive, we've got a very interesting comment on that point from David Freeberg-Apostle, so I'm going to bring him in and perhaps ask you, Bart, to comment on that. Mark, do you want to ask your question or make your point?
Yeah, there's a lot of talk about the larger organisations, whether they be tier one or OEMs, about making sure we have resilient supply chain, the better supply chain, the critical supply chain. I understand all of that. I really do understand all of that. And it's very important that we protect those. But this is an excellent opportunity to identify what makes, in the eyes, our tier ones and our OEMs believe a company is performing poorly, and what is it they must do to make improvements. There's a great financial incentive to remove those. I get that, but the concern for me is we're going a long way down a line of this doesn't work, it's broken, so let's throw it away, rather than let's fix it.
So, going to ask Bart to say something, and you, David, absolutely will bring you in. You've raised your hand very clearly there. So, just in the interest of time, Bart, do you have some comments on Mark's point? And then I know David's been working in this area, and then we'll close the meeting formally and then carry on if we want. Over to you, Bart.
Just a quick comment that if the prime is sending inappropriate signals, then it deserves everything it gets. We heard a comment about integrity earlier. I think we've got to avoid supply chain bullying. In terms of opportunities at the moment, I think there are real opportunities for companies that have not engaged in sales and operations planning formally to now do it in the crisis, and you'll see how important it is. You will never be fully ready, but you'll be more ready if you do effective sales and operations planning in these worst of times. But I'm well aware of SMEs being measured on performance, measured badly or poorly by major companies, but when you look at the signals they receive from the prime, they're often confusing, changing, lack rationale or lack explanation. So supply chain is supposed to be about partnership, and if it's adversarial, if it's command and control, don't expect it to work very well.
So thanks very much, Bart, for that. David, perhaps some closing comments for our whole session today from you.
So in answer to Mark's question, I'm one of the business assessors as part of the National Manufacturing Competitiveness Levels programme that's both for the aerospace and automotive sector. And we define competitiveness in terms of quality, cost, delivery, technology, flexibility and customer experience. So it's not just the Q&D stats that we often talk about. And we assess companies in terms of strategy and management systems. We look at manufacturing operations, we look at their new product introduction processes, and we look at their supply chain management capability. And it's a really holistic view of what makes a company competitive. And we've continued to work with companies through lockdown to deliver that program and to deliver those assessments. I've interviewed over 15 different primes and tier ones globally on the competitiveness of UK suppliers, and it's that sort of detail and it's that sort of support that companies need to understand what their customers are really thinking about them, but then to understand what they've got to do to change the perception of their organisations.
Perhaps if you wouldn't mind me saying so, then it'd probably be a good idea to post those on the MAA website.
Yeah, let's do some follow up there, Mark. I think this session has been very, very fruitful in terms of future ideas. I've been typing up notes myself in terms of how we connect the subjects that we've raised here to the support that's available out there, and how we potentially focus some of our work within Aerospace UP, working hopefully with Bart and colleagues on how we help companies do better planning, whatever the environment from the customers, or how we help the customers perhaps communicate better with the suppliers, as we alluded to earlier. So I'm going to close the session off formally and thank all of our special guests today, David, Clive, Bart and Alan. Alan had to leave. I think we've now filling up our diaries with Teams meetings, and some of them start on the hour and some of them on the half hour. So we're finding people joining for 2/3 of a meeting more frequently. But that's worked out very well today. We really appreciate your inputs. We've generated lots of discussion in the chat and lots of networking and connections. So thank you very much for that. And we look forward to seeing you and all our participants again next time.
Thank you, Andrew.
So thanks, guys. Thanks a lot, Bart. Really, really interesting. So, and I think because you were very broad in your presentation, covering lots of areas, you can be very flexible or agile. There's the word I was looking for. So, thinking on your feet, as well as both you, David, and Clive, because what happens in a session like this is that themes emerge, which may not be what we were going to do if nobody spoke. But
it's great to track the text chat, isn't it, to see what questions are likely to come up.
Well, that's one of the ways we've tried to do this, which is to ask people to, they want to ask a question, tell us what the subject matter is, and then we'll bring you in, and then we can guide people. That Pamela and I do a great deal. So absolutely fantastic. So if there's anybody out there in the participant list that has a question or a comment to make, now we're all having tea and coffee and having that final biscuit after the meeting before we drive back to our offices, or we imagine ourselves doing that, then please do come in, raise your hand or just speak up. We're always keen to hear from people. And in the go ahead.
Sorry, Andrew, it's Mark Wood.
You go ahead, Mark.
Hello,
yeah,
Mark,
sorry,
and Stan,
thanks, Dan. Yeah, okay, cheers, thanks. Yeah, I just posted a comment just as the session was closing, and I think there's a lot of really good talk, and understandably so, about looking up at what customers are doing with regards to potential supply consolidation and sort of sizes of pies and that. But I also think that there is a huge opportunity for people to look within their own supply chains and go way beyond raw materials and components and assess that whole cost. It also forms a part of their own supply chain risk bit. So if your supplier of IT hardware or infrastructure was to collapse, what would you do? So I think there's a great amount of opportunity there that people can explore and tap into. And quite frankly, I wouldn't have a business if there weren't those opportunities there. We see opportunities in excess of 10%, 20, even 30% cost reduction opportunities there, just by doing something a bit more strategic rather than more of a day-to-day tactical operational activity.
So a question, Mark, you're absolutely right, and I was just typing that up in my list of four things as well in the sort of ops management area in general. We've got a working group, our best practice supply chain performance group that looks at best practice, that will get engaged in this with Annette Rothwell. I think one of my challenges is then going to be for us to think about companies. We're going to be asking companies to do some restructuring here and some thinking and new planning and so on, while they have just made a lot of the staff that would have done this redundant. So how are we going to actually help them with those challenges and provide that external support from our members like you, from our intellectual leaders like Bart, and from our funded programs like Christine, and our consultants like David and Clive. David, you're using the hands function very well here. I'm very impressed. We must all learn from David. And Stan, I do know that you wanted to come in. David, over to you.
I was just going to respond to Mark's point, which I think is a really good one. Literally yesterday, I've written into one of the work stream plans for one of the SC21 competitiveness and growth companies that I'm working with, that they should perform a value stream map and material information flow analysis of the supply chains they're sitting in, because they're sitting amongst raw material providers, but also distributors and logistics providers. And I think, Mark, you're right. There are lots of opportunities to understand how we do this better.
Yeah, I think. I mean, I can give it a couple of examples where. No, I've had an inquiry come in last week, and hopefully we'll hear about that in the next day or so. And that company is spending around about £8.5 million a year, and they've done absolutely no strategic thinking on that whatsoever. My gut feel would say we can deliver £850,000, 10% direct to their bottom line within 6 months. So I think, to Andrew's point, no, actually, funded support for those types of activities, I think, is a really positive thing that needs to be explored, because I think people don't know what they don't know. We've got a spend analytics tool that we use where we can map out that whole supply chain and identify opportunities for their own consolidation. If you want to do collaborative relationships with suppliers going forward, if you're working with 15 tooling suppliers, you're never going to have a collaborative relationship. But likewise, you're offering a bigger pie to smaller companies if you can consolidate that and be clear on what you need from a business perspective. So there's lots of little things there that I think can really help unlock lots of opportunities and, quite frankly, give people the headroom that they need.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Stan, were you going to come in on this kind of point, because you were before Clive, or a different point, and I'll bring you in after Clive?
Sure. Well, yes, Mark's made a very good point, but consolidation also leads to centralisation, which is a significant risk. There's a point at which you increase the risk, not decrease it, and that's a difficult point to understand. It's a difficult point to reach, I should say.
We were just there are two aspects to this that we've been looking at. One is that the Rolls Royces and the Airbus want a consolidated supply chain, but if it consolidates too much, they don't want it at all. So there's that on the one hand, and then we've seen some evidence that I've talked about. I can't say much about it, of a large company that is moving from dual sourcing when a product is dual sourced in the UK and in Asia to a single source in China. And that's it. That's in our aerospace industry in June 2020.
Yeah.
And you think that might help on the procurement side, because you can promise lower prices and therefore less spend. Is that going to be a resilient supply chain ? So anyway, but it's not theoretical.
Sorry, Andrew, just on that point. So that's purchasing. Procurement is about the overall strategic management of the supply chain, which includes risk. And I think there's a key distinction there to be had. I think that is a very short-sighted view. I talk in terms of right-sized supply chains. I think that's how we have to start thinking about the terminology.
No, I do understand. So I hope I didn't misspeak there, but that's right. It's driven by a sort of narrow objective, and therefore the all the unintended consequences that we can all predict. Somehow the organisation itself is unable to internalise those. Clive and then Bart.
Yes, that theory applies to aftermarket as well. You know, we're currently working with somebody who's purely in aftermarket, and out of about an 80 million turnover, they hold around 16 million value of spares all over the world. And you know, we're already seeing they've got, you know, the kind of numbers that Mark was talking about there. They're going to have that opportunity to reduce costs in multiple directions. So the way they finance those spares, how they manage the logistics, and how they manage their customer interface, going back to the S&OP points that were made earlier.
Thanks, Clive. Bart?
Yeah, thinking about this in terms of scenario planning, any company that's going to single source from China is really not aware of global politics and the changing global environment. In the next year, I could see much more regulation affecting supply chains. Defense supply chains first, of course. Look at all the discussion around Huawei. But what are kind of critical infrastructure, supply chains, and any supply chain where a country like the UK or the US feels needs to be protected, there will be legislation. We've already got legislation around sustainability, around modern slavery, around conflict minerals. There will be legislation that will not permit certain routes of supply, I'm pretty sure, and sooner rather than later. So scenario planning should be thinking about the dangers of our flat world that we became used to, borderless, where we could make almost anything anywhere. Things have changed.
Yeah, I agree with that, Bart. And I think the other driver for this is going to be companies like the big company that I just talked about, in their supply development work and in their scorecard work with suppliers. They're going to be trying to ensure that those companies have far more sustainable and more resilient supply chains, and pay more attention rather than just a tick box approach in terms of whether companies have assessed their own supply chains for resilience. And I think it goes back to Mark's point that about the difference between purchasing on the one hand and having a procurement strategy on the other. And I think what we see is what one of our colleagues, hey, bring you in, Mike, was talking about embedded behaviours, which was a euphemism for sort of short-term panic, basically. And so whether that will last, I don't know, but we were surprised to see it. It's only in one area of one company's procurement, so we can't talk about the detail because then everybody would know who it is. But we have seen it taking place. Over to you, Mike, and then we'll bring Stan back in. Mike just switched his picture on there, so nice to see you, Mike. It's clearly nice weather down in Worcestershire. I don't know where you are, Mark.
I'm in Derby.
Well, I'm in
the sun in the back garden.
Yeah, fantastic. Over to you then, Mike, and I see that you're there again, Stan. Over to you, Mike.
Can't help but feel, Andrew, this is almost certainly an agenda item for the Business Development Group. This has got some teeth and it needs to be let loose, because from the previous session having it on Monday, there was a lot of talk about making sure the business and the supply chain are fit for purpose. And there's no actual dialogue around that or a meaningful agenda. And I can't help but feel this really is an important point, not least with the actual MRP signals now taking shape and some focus. It's a decline of some vigor. So this, I feel, is almost certainly a one-day session event for the MAA to chair and develop.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Mike is a long-standing member of our business development group and an ex-director of the MAA until he moved out of county temporarily or out of region temporarily. So Mike is well versed in the kind of work that we do and is reminding us that our business development group, which is the group that Alan chairs, who was the discussant earlier on, need to be engaged in this as well. So absolutely right, Mike. Stan.
Yes, I'd like to mirror some of the comments that Bart made. It's clear that protectionism is on the radar again. The US clearly has been looking at that for a few years now. Germany and France have also flown their colours with the COVID investments directly into companies. So that is very much on the radar. And Mark and I were talking only a few days ago. Mark is, if you don't mind me saying, Mark, you're looking at having some involvement in the Aerospace UP project and program. And we were talking about technology road mapping. Blockchain came up. You also mentioned it earlier, Bart. Blockchain, in my opinion, is the next internet boom. It will change everything to an unrecognizable level, just as the internet has changed it in the last 20 years. And this is the next stage. And I'm very, very interested in blockchain. You don't have to understand it, as Bart mentioned, in order to use it. It's like your TV or the internet itself. You just use it. People build application layers to make them usable. And I'm very, very interested in this. And I'd really like to come along when it's allowed to do so in our childhood restricted world. I'd like to come and see you, Bart, if I may. And perhaps, Mark, you might want to join me, because there's some really interesting stuff in blockchain.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
Yeah, Stan and Mark, when we're able to have a kind of physical meeting, that'll be good. But even in the interim, we might be able to do something on Teams.
Yeah, Stan is one of our technology managers. Bart probably should have introduced him properly earlier. So works like Pamela and Peter for the MAA and is therefore part of the Aerospace UP delivery team. So that's brilliant. And we know from Bart talking, Bart's interested in finding some supply chain companies, big tier 1 companies potentially. Has a really good student who could potentially do some work in this area. And possibly Aerospace UP, bringing it all together, we can actually join things up. Christine, when we talked with Bart earlier, was noting that Aerospace UP has opportunities to deploy students out into companies as well. So we could perhaps try and connect everything up there. So
yes,
listen, colleagues.
I meant to just add very shortly, Andrew. Yes, the blockchain could solve many of these issues in the supply chain by providing an enormously open fidelity and visibility of everything that happens right down to component level, and traceability, which plays very much to that protectionism that Bart mentioned earlier.
So as the naive economist, as you know, that's my role in these conversations, I would ask the same question again, which is systems that are perfect, databases that are perfect, models that are brilliant are all brilliant unless people won't provide you the data. And aerospace is an area of work where companies are really unwilling to be open book and provide data because of the connections that Bart was talking about earlier. They're so close together that customers can't shake poorly performing suppliers off if they want to, because of the connections in terms of quality control and cost of change. And that creates a culture where there's no way the supplier will give the customer any information about what's going on in their factory or what the lower tiers of the supply chain are. So I'll be really interested if we can find ways to share data or create models, perhaps with an isolated chunk of the supply chain, for example, to show that it can be done, that would then interest the customers in thinking, actually, this can be done within an area of the supply chain around a particular core company or around a company which has a key role in the supply chain, and model something to show that it can be done. Because if you take it to Rolls, or if you take it to Pattern Air, they're going to be thinking, you know, we've got our set. That you'll get that sort of rejection that you usually get. Stanley Richard to respond.
And I can see, yes, you're talking about centralized nodes there, a prime or a tier one is a centralized node. Blockchain isn't not all of blockchain, not every blockchain. There's many different types of blockchains, but many are decentralized by their very nature, and that could well lead to ways of working around the obfuscating node, such as a Rolls-Royce, for instance, and working around with what is available and providing supplier signals without which are very, very accurate, without even involving the customer.
Well, good response to my sceptical question, Stan. So I'm looking forward to what we're going to do. Listen, colleagues, it is 10 to 1. And we've had a lovely discussion after the meeting, which I really appreciate. And a number of people have stayed and listened to us, so I think they've enjoyed it as well. So great that we've carried on. We picked up something really interesting in the meeting today, so I'm very grateful to all of you for participating. It's been very, very fruitful for me. So I'm going to thank everybody formally again, particularly David and Clive and Bart and Alan, who already had to leave. And those of you, Mike and Stan and Mark and the other Mark, who've been very actively participating in what we do. And note that we'll be back on tomorrow doing business development, looking at MRO, because it's a market many of our companies don't look at when they possibly should, and understanding the cycle of MRO, which is different from OE, as we've seen. Looking at an opportunity with Boeing, believe it or not, which is to get into the Boeing supply chain now while they're slowing down and reorganizing themselves. That comes through the work our DIT has been doing. So it's the same work that Chris Gain and colleagues have been doing that spoke at our conference last year, but they're continuing that work. But also taking rail as a diversification example for us. So I avoided medical, which would have been obvious. Then we're going to be doing an event with Medilink talking about medical on the 9th of July anyway, where there'll be a keynote speaker who wants to tell our people what some of the systems are that you need to get through to get into the NHS, because everywhere that we might say a Rolls-Royce or an Airbus at the top of our supply chain causes issues, when I talk to the medical people, I'm always surprised. They say, oh yeah, that's just like the NHS. So you wouldn't think so, but the supply chain into the NHS resembles the aerospace supply chain, they say. When you start to think about the safety regimes and so on, you begin to understand it, or at least the naive person like me begins to see. So thanks very much, everybody, and we'll see you at a future meeting. I'll just do a little bit of winding up with Pamela and Christine and our team if they're still there. So see you all tomorrow. Thanks, David.
Okay.
Thanks,
Thank
Bart.
you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thanks, Mike.
Okay. Thank you.
Just let some people leave, Pamela, I think, now, so we can do a quick wrap up. It's clouding over where I am. The sky was blue and lovely and blue, and it's getting that hazy clouding over now. So I can just see the high level stratus clouds, just make out their shapes, but it's bright enough anyway that we don't want any suntan. PJ was there. Nice to see you, PJ. Should just be leaving in a minute.
I'm going to see. I think he's I think he's on another call or something.
Yeah. PJ may well, but anyway, he's a friend of ours, so we can discuss anyway. Hey, Max, are you there?
I
think I saw a Maxine there. Oh, no response. Invited, no response. So
yeah, she's the other. Do you want me to switch off the recording now?
Yeah, why not?